Ever heard of Fort Ross? Located almost due west of Sacramento and right on the shore of the Pacific Ocean, is a former Russian establishment or outpost. That's right, a Russian hangout in California. It was the first multi-ethnic community north of the Spanish missions in what is now the U.S. state of California. Owned and operated by the Russian-American Company, it was the hub of the southernmost Russian settlements in North America from 1812 to 1841. Notably cosmopolitan, different ethnic groups settled in and around the fort: Native Californians, Native Alaskans, Russians, Finns, and Swedes. It has been the subject of archaeological investigation and is a California historical landmark, a National Historic Landmark, and on the National Register of Historic Places. And now is part of California's Fort Ross State Historic Park. Let's dive into the specifics of what exactly was going on here and how it ended up becoming part of California and its interesting history. In the very beginning, the earliest people known to have lived at the site were there during the Upper Archaic period, 1000 BC to 500 AD, and the Lower Emergent period, 1000 to 1500 AD. But the main occupation began at 1500 and continued through 1812 AD. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggest that the native Californians lived in large and mostly permanent villages. In summer months, they had special purpose camps they would go to in order to get certain resources. This area was one of such camps, used for its access to tidal and marine resources. Ethnographic evidence suggests that the area where Fort Ross would be located was a large part of Kashaya-Pomo territory. Their name for the site was Mataini. Their exact arrival date is unknown, but according to linguistic and archaeological data, they moved to Mataini sometime between 1000 and 500 BC. Archaeological data shows that the Kashaya-Pomo increased their subsistence activities upon arrival at this site and gained greater diversity in their toolkits. Beginning with Columbus in 1492, the Spanish presence in the Western Hemisphere traveled west across the Atlantic Ocean, then around or across the Americas to reach the Pacific Ocean. The Russian expansion, however, moved east across Siberia and the northern Pacific. In the early 19th century, Spanish and Russian expansion met along the coast of Spanish Alta California, with Russia pushing south and Spain pushing north. By that time, British and American fur trade companies had also established a coastal presence in the Pacific Northwest, and Mexico was soon to gain independence. Mexico ceded Alta California to the United States following the Mexican-American War in 1848. The history of the Russian Fort Ross settlement began during Spanish rule and ended under Mexican rule. The present name, Fort Ross, appears first on a French chart published in 1842 by Eugène Duflot de Moffres, who visited California in 1840. The name of the fort is said to derive from the Russian word Rus or Ros, the same root as the word Russia. Basically, Ross is a poetic name for a Russian in the Russian language. The Spanish sometimes called it Presidio Ruso or Presidio de Bodega. Russian personnel from the Alaskan colonies initially arrived in California aboard American ships. In 1803, American ship captains already involved in the Sea Otter maritime fur trade in California proposed several joint venture hunting expeditions to Alexander Andreevich Baranov on half shares, using Russian supervisors and native Alaskan hunters to hunt for seals and otters along the Alta and Baja Californian coast. Subsequent reports by the Russian hunting parties of uncolonized stretches of coast encouraged Baranov, the chief administrator of the Russian-American Company, or RAC, to consider a settlement in California north of the limit of Spanish occupation in San Francisco. In 1806, the Russian ambassador to Japan and RAC director Nikolai Rezanov undertook an exploratory trade mission to California to establish a formal means of procuring food supplies in exchange for Russian goods in San Francisco. While guests of the Spanish, Rezanov's captain, Lieutenant Kvostov, explored and charted the coast north of San Francisco Bay and found it completely unoccupied by other European powers. Upon his return to Novoarchangelsk, New Archangel, Rezanov recommended to Baranov and the Emperor Alexander that a settlement be established in California. This new settlement of Ross had been organized through the initiative of the Russian company. Its purpose was to establish a Russian settlement there or in some other place not occupied by Europeans, and to introduce agriculture there by planting hemp, flax, and all manner of garden produce. They also introduced livestock breeding in the outlying areas, both horses and cattle, hoping that the favorable climate, which is almost identical to the rest of California, and the friendly reception on the part of the indigenous people would assist in its success. In 1808, Baranov sent two ships, the Kadyak and the SV Nikolai, on an expedition south to establish settlements for the RAC with instructions to bury secret signs or possession plaques. Kuskov, on the Kadyak, was instructed to bury the plaques with an appropriate possession ceremony at Trinidad, Bodega Bay, and on the shore north of San Francisco, indicating Russian claims to the land. After sailing into Bodega Bay in 1809 on the Kadyak and returning to Novoarchangelsk with beaver skins and 1,160 otter pelts, Baranov ordered Kuskov to return and establish an agricultural settlement in the area. He also named the Russian river the Slavic River. Fort Ross was established as an agricultural base from which the northern settlements could be supplied with food, while also continuing trade with Alta California. Yet during its initial 10 years of operations, the post provided the company with nothing but heavy expenses for its maintenance. Fort Ross itself was the hub of a number of smaller Russian settlements comprising what was called Fortress Ross on official documents and charts produced by the company itself. Colony Ross referred to the entire area where Russians had settled. These settlements constituted the southernmost Russian colony in North America and were spread over an area stretching from Point Arena to Tamales Bay. The colony included a port at Bodega Bay called Port Rumiantsev, a sealing station on the Farallon Islands 18 miles out to sea from San Francisco, and by 1830, 3 small farming communities called ranchos near present-day Grayton, a mile north of the present-day town of Bodega Bay. In addition to farming and manufacturing, the company carried on its fur trading business at Fort Ross, but by 1817, after 20 years of intense hunting by Spanish, American, and British ships, followed by Russian efforts, sea otters had been practically eliminated from the area. Fort Ross was the site of California's first windmills and shipbuilding. Russian scientists associated with the colony were among the first to record California's cultural and natural history. The Russian managers introduced many European innovations such as glass windows, stoves, and all-wood housing into Alta California. The native populations of the Sonoma and Napa County regions were affected by smallpox, measles, and other infectious diseases that were common across Asia, Europe, and Africa. One instance can be traced to the settlement of Fort Ross. The first vaccination in California history was carried out by the crew of the Kutuzov, a Russian-American company vessel arriving from Callao, Peru, which brought vaccine to Monterey in August 1821. The Kutuzov surgeon vaccinated 54 people. Another instance of disease prevention was when a visiting Hudson's Bay Company hunting party was refused entry to the colony in 1833, when it was feared that a malaria epidemic, which had devastated the Central Valley, was carried by its members. In 1837, a very deadly epidemic of smallpox that came from this settlement wiped out most native people in the Sonoma and Napa County regions. Upon his arrival in Alta California in 1839, John Sutter was attracted to the land near the Sacramento River. To obtain the land and permission to settle in the territory, he went to the capital at Monterey and requested a grant from Governor Juan Bautista Alvarado. Alvarado saw Sutter's plan of establishing a colony in the Central Valley as useful in buttressing the frontier which he was trying to maintain against Indians, Russians, Americans, and British. Sutter persuaded Governor Alvarado to grant him 48,400 acres of land for the sake of curtailing American encroachment on the Mexican territory of California. Sutter was given the right to represent in the establishment of New Helvetia all the laws of the country, to function as political authority and dispenser of justice, in order to prevent the robberies committed by adventurers from the United States, to stop the invasion of savage Indians, and the hunting and trading by companies from the Columbia River. He named the settlement New Helvetia. In an 1841 inventory for John Sutter that described the settlement surrounding the fort, 24 planked dwellings with glazed windows, a floor, and a ceiling. Each had a garden. There were 8 sheds, 8 bathhouses, and 10 kitchens. By 1839, the settlement's agricultural importance had decreased considerably. The local population of fur-bearing marine mammals had been long depleted by international overhunting, and the recently secularized California missions no longer supplemented the agricultural needs of the Alaskan colonies. Following the formal trade agreement in 1838 between the Russian-American Company in New Archangel and Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Vancouver and Fort Langley for their agricultural needs, the settlement at Fort Ross was no longer needed to supply the Alaskan colonies with food. The Russian-American Company consequently offered the settlement to various potential purchasers, and in 1841 it was sold to John Sutter, a Mexican citizen of Swiss origin, soon to be renowned for the discovery of gold at his lumber mill in the Sacramento Valley. Although the settlement was sold for $30,000 to Sutter, some Russian historians assert the sum was never paid. Therefore, legal title of the settlement was never transferred to Sutter, and the area still belongs to the Russian people. A recent Sutter biography, however, asserts that Sutter's agent, Peter Burnett, paid the Russian-American Company agent William Stewart $19,788 in notes and gold on April 13, 1849, thereby settling the outstanding debt for Fort Ross and Bodega. Possession of Fort Ross passed from Sutter through successive private hands and finally to George Call. In 1903, the stockade and about 3 acres of land were purchased from the Call family by the California Historical Landmarks Commission. 3 years later, it was turned over to the state of California for preservation and restoration as a state historic monument. Since then, the state has acquired more of the surrounding land for preservation purposes. California Department of Parks and Recreation, as well as many volunteers, put extensive efforts into restoration and reconstruction work in the fort. The road was eventually diverted, and the parts of the fort that had been demolished for the road were rebuilt. The old roadway can still be seen going from the main gate to the northwest. The rest, within the fort and extending northeast, has been removed. Highway 1 moved to its current alignment sometime in the mid-late 1970s. Most of the existing buildings on the site are reconstructions. Cooperative research efforts with Russian archives will help to correct interpretive errors present in structures that date from the Cold War period. The only original structure remaining is the Rochov House. Known as the Commandant's House from the 1940s through the 1970s, it was the residence of the last manager, Alexander Rochov. Renovated in 1836 from an existing structure, it was titled the New Commandant's House in the 1841 inventory to differentiate it from the old Commandant's House, Kuskov House. The Rochov House, or in original documents, Administrator's House, is at the center of efforts to reinterpret Russia's part in California's colonial history. The Fort Ross Interpretive Association has received several federally funded grants to restore both exterior and interior elements. While its exterior has been partially restored, its interior is currently undergoing restoration to reflect the recent research that shows a more cosmopolitan and refined aspect of colonial life at the fort. The Fort Ross Chapel collapsed in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, but much of the original structural woodwork remained, and it was re-erected in 1916, but retained the appearance of the American ranch period modifications when it was used as a stable. Several other restorations ensued, but none incorporated the information in Voznesensky's 1841 watercolor, which portray the chapel with copper-clad cupola and tower and red metal roof. The Fort Ross Chapel was found eligible for designation as a National Historic Landmark in 1969, architecturally significant as a rare U.S. example of a log church constructed on a Russian quadrilateral plan. An accidental fire destroyed the chapel on October 5, 1970. This loss of the original workmanship and materials of the chapel led to withdrawal of the chapel's landmark designation in 1971. A complete reconstruction of the chapel was undertaken in 1973, and the Fort Ross settlement, as a whole, retains its National Historic Landmark designation. Today, Fort Ross is now a part of Fort Ross State Historic Park and is open to the public. In addition to fishing, hiking, surfing, exploring tide pools, Picnicking, whale watching, and bird watching, the park has become a popular destination for scuba divers, some of whom visit Fort Ross Reef. The wreckage of the SS Pomona lies just offshore Fort Ross State Park, where it sank. The SS Pomona, otherwise known as the Pride of the Coastal Fleet, was a 225-foot-long, 33-foot-wide steel-hull steamer built for speed and luxury as it traveled between San Francisco and Vancouver, carrying passengers and cargo for nearly 20 years. On March 17, 1908, en route from San Francisco to Eureka, the SS Pomona ran up on a submerged rock pinnacle along the Sonoma coast. The captain reversed power to free the ship and headed to Fort Ross Cove with the hopes of running her onto the beach to save the passengers, crew, and cargo. Unfortunately, while still half a mile from shore, she struck rocks again and held fast, taking on water more rapidly this time. Captain Charles Swanson ordered, "Abandon ship," and it's been sitting there under about 40 feet of water ever since. Fort Ross State Park is 3,393 acres of historical wonderment, not to mention the nature and beauty. If you get the chance, go visit. If you have already been, leave me a comment and let me know what you thought about your visit. And as always, happy trails!